Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, chapter 1, Halacha 1. This is part 8, the final part of the Shiur on Halacha 1. Today we're going to be getting into the timing of the evening Shema. In chapter 1, Halacha 2, it's going to be talking about the timing for the morning Shema. But everything in this halacha now is going to be talking about the evening. And then we're going to get into the offerings. It's the next part of the Mishnah. And we're going to get into the offerings because that also has the same timing as, or a lot of timing issues that could be similar to what's going on with the Shema. So yesterday we were talking about three Tanaim who disputed other rabbis on other occasions, and they did not follow in practice their own minority opinion, and they conceded. But what do we do here with Rabban Gamliel? This is the Mishnah in here, and the Gemara is gonna propose an interesting solution that maybe they're not really talking about a dissent at all. Maybe they're talking about a different nuance. So here's how the Gemara goes. It says, now, can it be that Rabban Gamliel disputes the rabbis regarding the time of the evening Shema and does not follow his own minority opinion in actual practice? And the Gemara is going to give an interesting answer here. It's going to say, it is different here in regard to the Shema, since even after the time for reciting the Shema has passed, it can be recited for the purpose of articulating a passage of the Torah. In other words, what this is saying that, even according to the rabbi's opinion, it would be correct for Rabban Gamliel's sons to still say the Shema after midnight because they're still getting credit in Shemayim for saying a Torah passage. And so it's going to be what this sugya is hinting at is, maybe it's going to be a lot like, you're still getting a mitzvah. You're not getting the mitzvah of having said the Shema directly, but you're still getting another mitzvah being that you're still reciting a biblical passage. And you could see here that, there's other cases where, if you were leaning on the animal and then you were going to slaughter it and it got a nick by one of the knives and it caused a blemish, you slaughtered it anyway, you put it on the altar anyway. Well, you didn't do anything. You made a sin. You didn't make a mitzvah. And over here, it's a different case because over here, if you still say the Shema at a different time, okay, you didn't get the Shema of the mitzvah of the Shema, but you're still getting a mitzvah of saying the Torah passage. So maybe that's what Rabban Gamliel's answer is really meaning. In other words, that we also have a rule in the Torah that if you missed something. Let's say you something happened and you forgot to say mincha. You can do two minchas, or you could do Shemona Esrei twice, even in the evening, to help to rectify it. In Shemayim, in this calculation is going to be 100% rectification. I'm not sure, but there's some degree of rectification, and so that it could be that either you're getting some credit for saying a Torah passage, or you could either, says the Haredim, that there's some degree of rectification for voluntarily reciting the passages now, even at this other time, much the same as one who missed a prayer can rectify the omission to some extent by praying twice during the next period of prayer. So, it could be either one of these explanations. In other words, this Gemara could be saying, go ahead and say it anyway because you're still getting a mitzvah. Or it could be that, hey, you're still getting some sort of rectification, so go ahead and say it anyway. That's a really interesting nuance to try to understand it, and it makes a lot of sense, but the Gemara is going to reject this explanation. So it's going to sharpen it down because it's not interested, the way we're going to be going with this part of the sugya and the next part, is it's going to really hone it down to time on when is the Rabbanan and the D'oraita time for when this mitzvah still counts as a mitzvah. So the Gemara is not going to be satisfied with just saying, oh, well, go say it anyway and get credit in Shemayim for having said a Torah passage. The Gemara is going to reject this because it wants to come back and say, no, no, no. We want to know, really, are you still going to get credit in Shemayim for having dispatched the obligation of the Shema? So the Gemara rejects the explanation and says, accordingly, though, even if it was after the rising of the light of the dawn, Rabban Gamliel should have told them to recite the Shema. In other words, this is questioning and saying, well, why did he say that they should recite it only if the light of the dawn has not yet risen? In other words, says the Haredim, saying that, in fact, Rabban Gamliel meant merely that they could compensate somewhat for the Mishma by reading the Torah passages after the time passed, but he should have advised them to do this even if it was already day. So clearly, when he told his sons, if the light of the dawn has not yet risen, you are obligated to recite the Shema. And the Haredim says that he meant that the biblical obligation is still incumbent on them in accordance with his own opinion. In other words, what the Haredim is pointing out is that if Rabban Gamliel had just said, look, say it anyway, even if the light of the sun has already come out, and you get some credit in Shemayim for it, and you're still getting a mitzvah. But the Haredim is pointing out, the Gemara is pointing out, that no, it's up until the light. So if it was just a concern to just get the mitzvah anyway, it would have said, yeah, say it anytime you want. And it doesn't do that. It limits it back to that period of time as a wall, to say up until the time of the light. And so what that's trying to show is that you're still obligated to recite the Shema as a biblical obligation, and looks like in accordance with his own opinion. So there's the Gemara clearly rejects this opinion of saying, well, you still get this credit in Shemayim for saying the biblical passage, which you do, but it doesn't match what the Mishnah says, and it doesn't match what this Gemara says up until the rising of the light of the dawn. So we're stuck in here trying to get up with this dispute as to whether this is going to be still the Doraita obligation, whether it's going to be at midnight or it's going to be here at just before the light of the dawn. Now the Haredim points out about this that it's disputed whether someone who missed a Shema recitation can affect a degree of compensation by reciting it twice during the next period when the Shema is recited. In other words, the next day for the evening Shema or the next night for the morning Shema. And according to the view that compensation is possible, says the Haredim, we may explain that the Gemara does not mean to reject the notion of compensation, but rather to prove that Rabban Gamliel could not have intended for mere compensation. So that's a really strong point. And then we see that there's other Tanaim who didn't follow their own opinion, but here it looks like Rabban Gamliel is still following his own opinion. So what's going on here? And the Gemara is going to try to prove another resolution from this original question of how could it be that he's saying to do it up until the light of the morning. So in either case, it's either not going to be the concern. The concern is that we're not worried about doing, extra mitzvahs here, or that you could get some sort of fixing by doing it, twice in a different period of time. But really, the focus is going to be how can it be where we're keeping consistent with this wall, this limit, because something else is going on here. So the Gemara goes to this next point and says, and there are those who wish to say that this is why Rabban Gamliel followed his own minority opinion in actual practice, even though other Tanaim cited above did not follow their own minority opinions. The Gemara says there, in the cases cited, that's the one that we talked about with Rabbi Akiva and Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Meir, the situations were such that the various Tanaim were able to fulfill the words of the sages who disputed them. In other words, what they're saying is that they went away from their own minority opinion and abided by the majority view. And the Gemara says, here, however, midnight has already passed, so Rabban Gamliel's sons were not able any longer to fulfill the words of the sages who rule that the Shema must be recited before midnight. And the Gemara finishes and says, in this situation, therefore, Rabban Gamliel told them to act in accordance with his opinion, even though it represents the minority view. Now, I want to point out that this is also going to be in the Bavli, and I want to point out something from the Haredim here about this. The Haredim explains about this that Rabban Gamliel did not mean to tell his sons that they were permitted initially to, litchila, to postpone the recitation of the evening Shema up until past midnight, and that they could do so in the future. Really, he's not saying that this is a future thing. It's just like this just happened, and okay, act in the minority opinion to at least try to salvage something. The Haredim continues, says, although this is actually his opinion, in practice he bowed to the majority view that the Shema must be recited before midnight, says Haredim, about explaining this passage. And all he meant is that since, in any event, it was too late to fulfill the sage's word at this point, his sons had nothing to lose by reciting the Shema in accordance with his opinion. That's the brilliant note by the Haredim. And I want to bring up a commentary on the Rashba to Bavli 2a, and it looks like there could be some sort of disagreement about the Yerushalmi's final answer here, but it actually does not contradict between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi at all. Okay, in other words, says the Rashba about talking about these two sugyas, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. It means here in this case that the sages actually view midnight as merely the initial limit, and they concede that after the fact one may recite the Shema until the light of dawn rises. And the Rashba is saying that had Rabban Gamliel's sons asked him before midnight how to act, he would have deferred to the sages and ruled that they must recite the Shema immediately. But even though he himself does not recognize a midnight limit at all, and since they asked him after midnight, when it was already too late to fulfill the mitzvah in the optimal manner decreed by the sages, he told them to recite the Shema at that time, for after the fact the sages concede to Rabban Gamliel, and the Shema could be recited up until dawn. Thus, the Gemara's final position corresponds with that of the Bavli. So a lot of times it'll look like there's a disagreement between Bavli and Yerushalmi, or it'll look like there's a big maloket between the Tanaim, but really there's really no maloket at all. And in fact, Rabban Gamliel here is ceding to the majority view. The sons came back after midnight, though, and now it's like, well, you can't go back in time, and you can't, had it been had it been an hour before, Chatzos, they would have said, okay, go ahead and say it now, but you can't go back in time, and so he said, okay, do it in the minority opinion, but this is not a ruling for future times. It's not a heter to keep doing it. It's just, okay, litchazila, like, yeah, it's not the preferred way to do it. It's okay, whatever. It's you're doing something. So here you see that something that's a little bit different than saying that, it's not saying it as a recitation to try to repair it. In other words, like waiting until the next day and doing it twice. And it's not a thing of, I'm getting a mitzvah anyway, so you may as well just do it. Really, what's happening here is they're showing that the time had passed, and since it's already passed, And since there's already an opinion by the sages that you can still do it after midnight, and that he's saying that you could do it up until the dawn, they're saying go ahead and say it anyway. What do you have to lose? But again, this is not a heter, and nobody in the world should interpret this as a heter. We have to follow what the sages say, and this is what the sages say. Now, there's another case about that one part of it, what the sages institute could be a gezerah. One way to interpret this is that there's a gezerah that was set up because the sages have and the rabbis have the power to set up fences, and that the Chatzos, the midnight, is the halachic midnight, is going to be a fence to protect against eating sacrificial offerings at the wrong time and coming in and eating something you forget about the time, because it's when the day rises, when Alot HaShachar happens. And if you're eating the sacrificial animals after that period of time, you get a special punishment for death from heaven, which is really serious. So the sages it could be that the sages set up this fence at halachic midnight, but the Doraita obligation is at sunrise. So it could be a difference where there's actually no disagreement at all, but one is talking about preserving a fence, which is D'Rabbanan, and one is a Doraita obligation. That's another way to look at it, and that's consistent with some of the Meforshim who explain the Mishnah that way. Anyway, one of the beautiful things that you see here is, Rabban Gamliel is acceding. He's acceding to the ruling of the sages. And, it's so important in our life to look at what the Gedolim of the day are saying. This is a Doraita obligation in Devarim. It says you're supposed to follow the sages of the day, because the sages of the day are, looking at all sorts of rules that didn't happen yet. I'll give you an example. Today, when you buy cranberry juice, for example, there's a lot of rules for hechsher that didn't happen before. They have a type of insect that when you squeeze it, it makes a perfectly red dye. And the practice for cranberry juice is to use this bug blood juice with this beetle blood juice to put it into the cranberry juice to make it very red. So you can't eat that. Like, it's not kosher. And, we didn't have this case, 300 years ago. We didn't have this case 2,000 years ago. It's a new invention. So you always have to listen to the fences that the sages put up, because they're doing it in context with the world that we're living in today, not only for the generation of who we are, but also the changes in the world around us. That's also a very important reason why we have to stay away from smartphones. Rabbi Kanievsky speaks very strongly about staying away from smartphones, and it's very important for you to have a kosher phone, because all of the tuma from the phone can go into your eyes, and it can start to confuse you and can start messing up your values and how you see the world. So if you have a smartphone, please consider finding a way to filter it, and certainly you should filter your internet. Now let's get on to the sacrificial offerings. So Gemara now is going to talk about the next Mishnah, and there's two versions of the actual Mishnah, okay? And the Gemara is going to address it. You could see another case of two versions in the Mishnah in Kalayim in chapter 2, Halacha 1. In one version of the Mishnah, it says 1 in 20. It's talking about cleaning the seed before planting, and you're taking out in a pile. You're taking out contaminated seed where it's mixed. And in one version of the Mishnah, it'll say you take out 1/24th, and in one version of the Mishnah, it says you take out 1/25th. And actually, what Rabbi Kanievsky points out is that they're actually referring to two different halachas. So, for instance, if you have a pile of seed that's there now, you take out 1/24th of a contaminated seed. On the other Mishnah, if you have 1/24th that drops into it, you take out 1/25th in order to clean it. So sometimes these differences of Mishnahs will have different points about the halacha. This one here is gonna there's gonna be a standard version, and there's going to be a version that is going to talk and add and the eating of the Pesach offerings. So let's get into this. So this is the final part of the Mishnah. It's going to tie into this time of midnight versus rising of the dawn. And the Gemara says that in the cases of the burning of sacrificial fats and limbs and the eating of Pesach offerings. So, and the eating of Pesach offerings is an addition. And the Gemara here is going to take and talk about this version of the Mishnah that adds in the eating of the Pesach offerings. So the Gemara reads as quoting from the Mishnah, because the rule of the way the Yerushalmi is edited it was when it's going to go talk about another topic, it's going to point out and re-quote the Mishnah. And that's how I know that there's a different version of the Mishnah, because this version of the Mishnah is not the same as other versions. So in the cases of the burning of the sacrificial fats and limbs and the eating of Pesach offerings, and the time of their mitzvah extends until the light of the dawn rises. So it quotes the Mishnah. That's the quote of the Mishnah. Now we know the subject that we're going to be talking about in the Yerushalmi. And the Gemara is now going to comment on this reading of the Mishnah. And in fact, it identifies that, we can see there's two different versions of the Mishnah. We learned in our Mishnah the clause, the eating of Pesach offerings. In other words, it's this addition. And the Gemara says, but there are those who do not teach the clause, the eating of the Pesach offerings in the Mishnah. So that really points it out. By the way, both views are going to also be in the Baraisa recorded in Bavli Berechot 9a. And here's how the Haredim explains this. Okay, the Haredim is saying that all Tanaim agree that the Pesach offering may be eaten only until midnight. However, some maintain that this represents biblical law, while others hold that it represents a rabbinical decree. For biblical law allows the Pesach offering to be eaten until daybreak. So our Mishnah is listing things that are subject to a midnight deadline by rabbinical decree. Now, what are these other things that are midnight deadline by rabbinical decree? And by the way, this is hinting that perhaps the rabbis were ruling a midnight decree, halachic midnight decree, with Chatzos, halachic midnight, on for the Shema, and that you could have a Doraita obligation up until the dawn. So keep that in mind. So the other topics of rabbinical decree, here they are. The Gemara says, thus, the one who teaches the clause, the eating of Pesach offerings in our Mishnah, maintains that the Mishnah follows the rabbis who hold that the Pesach may be eaten until daybreak by biblical law, and the midnight deadline was imposed by rabbinical decree. So the Haredim says about this, he says, the view of the rabbis is cited in the Brisa, attributes this opinion to Rabbi Akiva, and the Yerushalmi version puts it to anonymous rabbis. But in any event, says the Haredim, the first version of our Mishnah, which lists the eating of Pesach offerings among the things for which there is a rabbinic deadline of midnight, has a valid basis in accordance with this Tanaic opinion. So, what else do we see here? What else is going on? So, the one who teaches the clause that the eating of the Pesach in our Mishnah maintains that the Mishnah follows the rabbis. So it could be that the other version that they're teaching, the other Mishnah that they're teaching, is going to follow a Doraita obligation, and then the one that puts this in is going to follow where they're adding in the eating of the Pesach offerings in this Mishnah is going to follow the rabbi's opinion. So it could just be that the difference is, one view is, the list of the things that are Doraita, and the other thing is that, it could be D'Rabbanan, and, also, it could also be talking about those who hold that the Pesach offering may be eaten until daybreak by biblical law, and that the midnight deadline was actually going to be a rabbinic decree, so that's why they're listing it in there like that. So, like that two versions in Kalayim, where you have one being 1/24th of the seed and the other being 1/25th of the seed, just like over there, as Rabbi Kanievsky points out in his Beur series, that they're actually talking about two different laws. Over here, these differences in the Mishnah could be also talking about two different versions of the law. There's no disagreement. It doesn't contradict at all, not in the Kalayim case and not here. It's just talking about two different points. And that's why the Bavli and the Yerushalmi come to explain both different points. And it's important to understand the points. It helps us to understand this in a richer way. The Gemara continues and says that, and the one who does not teach the clause, the eating of Pesach offerings in our Mishnah, maintains that the Mishnah follows Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that the biblical law disallows consumption of the Pesach after midnight. So this is going to be a twist, because before we were looking at a possible D'Rabbanan limit at halachic midnight, and now we have Rabbi Eliezer saying, no, the midnight is actually going to be D'Oraita. Now, that's not going to be the halacha, but we want to understand what's going on here, because we want to really understand Rabbi Eliezer, who's Kodesh Kodeshim. So Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is also going to be paralleled in the Berechot Bavli 9a, and he does not explain or does not state explicitly that the midnight obligation is D'Oraita, but here he is, okay? But in this version he is. So here's how the Haredim talks about it. He says, according to Rabbi Eliezer's view, that the midnight limit for consumption of the Pesach is biblical, this rule cannot be included in the Mishnah among the instances in which the rabbis imposed a midnight deadline. So, also in Bavli Berechot 9a, there'll be an opinion by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah that states explicitly that the midnight limit for consumption of the Pesach is biblical, and he is the one who explains, a Gezerah Shava to help to prove that point. Over here, it's going to be Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the head of the academy. Rabbi Eliezer, this is a different Tana. So we have in the Bavli a different Tana who is going to be also agreeing with Rabbi Eliezer. Yerushalmi is going to be talking about Eliezer's opinion in this context, and that the opinions are that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is going to be in the Bavli, and then the opinion that's going to be coming up in the Bavli is going to be presented as Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. You can find that in page 9. So now the Gemara is citing Rabbi Eliezer's scriptural source, and again, this scriptural source that would be coming up in the Bavli would actually be quoted by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and this is what Rabbi Eliezer says. In the Yerushalmi, he says, and what is Rabbi Eliezer's basis for saying that biblically the Pesach may not be eaten after midnight? And the Gemara says, it is stated here regarding the eating of the Pesach, they shall eat the flesh on this night. So that, by the way, is quoting from Exodus in chapter 12, Pasuk 8. And so here you have a D'Oraita source, and it says they shall eat the flesh on this night. So the Gemara continues, says, and it is stating over there regarding the smiting of the firstborn, I shall pass through the land of Egypt on this night. That, by the way, is going to be in Exodus chapter 12, Pasuk 12. Now, the Bavli version, 9, specifies that the Gezerah Shava is not merely the word Lila, but the common phrases on this night. But over here on the Yerushalmi, in Rabbi Eliezer's view, it's only talking about night, saying night here and night here. And in the version stated by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, they're saying Balila Hazeh, which is on this night, instead of just Lila. So some difference, Bavli Yerushalmi. Over here, it's just saying, Rabbi Eliezer is saying night and night. And that's how he's creating a Gezerah Shava. And what's that Gezerah Shava going to be teaching us? The Gemara says, just as the night that is mentioned there refers to midnight, for that is when the firstborn were smitten. So that is stated explicitly over in Exodus 12, Pasuk 29. And so the Gemara says, so too, the night that is mentioned here refers to midnight. So basically, this is teaching that in the scripture, Doraita, that the Pesach may be eaten only until midnight, according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. So what's actually going on over here? So the Shlach in the commentary on the Bavli explains that this is derived from the Pesach not being eaten at the beginning of the night, because the Torah says, there you shall slaughter the Pesach in the afternoon when the sun sets. And the Shlach says that now the afternoon is not when the sun sets. And some Tanaim, says the Shlach, explain that the verse to mean that the offering is slaughtered in the afternoon and eaten when the sun sets. And the Shlach says that Rabbi Eliezer accepts this explanation and derives from it the Pesach may be eaten when the sun sets, and he must interpret the Gezerah Shava as teaching that midnight is the upper limit for eating the offering. So the Mara Fulda points out that the scriptural basis for the view of the Tanaim who disagree and hold that biblical law allows the Pesach to be eaten until daybreak is going to be it's going to be a little bit different. In other words, there are going to be Tanaim who are going to disagree, and they're going to use different scripture to try to prove that. And what really is happening here is that you have the smiting of the firstborn that's occurring at the stroke of midnight, and you have the Pesach offering where it can't be eaten in a single moment. So effectively, what Rabbi Eliezer is doing is he's saying that there's Gezerah Shava that must be teaching us about a limit for eating the offering, and it really brings up a question as well, how does Rabbi Eliezer know to interpret the Gezerah Shava as teaching the upper limit for eating the offering? And maybe it means to teach a lower limit that could indicate that the Pesach may be eaten only during the second half of the night, which begins at midnight. So there's a lot of questions here. So the Gemara is going to try to go back to which reading of the Mishnah is going to be correct. What is it going to be, the version that adds the eating of the Pesach, or is it going to be the version that leaves out and the eating of the Pesach? So what do we do with this? Rabbi Huna said the clause, the eating of the Pesach, should not be taught here, even though the version accords with the majority opinion of the rabbis. For we learned in a Mishnah, the Pesach offering, if left until after midnight, contaminates the hands that touch it. In other words, says the Haredim, he's saying that the basis for this ruling is that the flesh of the offering becomes nusser, which is it's past the usage, becomes nusser at midnight by biblical law, so it is subject to the general law that nusser contaminates the hands that touch it. Thus, we have an anonymous Mishnah which teaches that the midnight limit for eating the Pesach offering is biblical. The Haredim continues, says, we must therefore teach our Mishnah as also maintaining that the midnight limit is biblical, and it follows that the Mishnah cannot contain the clause, the eating of the Pesach offerings. That's going to be the explanation. The Haredim continues, and he says that, if this Mishnah would contain the clause, the eating of the Pesach offerings, and would hold that the midnight deadline is only rabbinic, then it would contradict the anonymous Mishnah in the tractate in Pesachim, which holds that the deadline is biblical. So since you have an anonymous Mishnah, and that's going to be authoritative, we have to teach that our Mishnah without the clause, where it leaves out the eating of the Pesach offering, that's the clause to leave out, such that it conforms with the anonymous Mishnah of Pesachim. So just real quick on Nasser, it's the meat, the sacrificial meat of the offering that's left past the time that's designated in the Torah for the consumption, and after that, it's disqualified and you have to burn it. So we always have this thing that we want to make sure that people eat it before, because we don't want to burn, or waste offerings or waste holy food. There's a biblical mandate not to waste biblical food, and it could be a very serious sin. So we have to be very careful not to let food, sacrificial food, stay too long. So the Mishnah is going to explain further, and it says, similarly, with respect to all these sacrifices that may be eaten for only one day, the time of their mitzvah actually extends until the light of the dawn rises. So the Gemara wants to clarify this all. We're talking about all these sacrifices. What does that mean? So Gemara says, all those sacrifices that may be eaten for only one day includes even the Kodashim Kalim offerings, which have a one day limit on the consumption. So I want to point out something by the Pnei Moshe. Pnei Moshe is saying that the Mishnah states all those sacrifices that may be eaten for only one day to teach that the rabbis imposed the midnight deadline even on the consumption of the Kodesh Kalim offerings that are biblically permitted for one day and a night. And that, by the way, you can see for the Nazir's ram, for example, or the Toda offering. But anyway, the Pnei Moshe says that the concern for a biblical transgression is not as great in this case, and the rabbis deemed it proper to protect against it, even in regard to Kodashim Kalim. So, we have this thing where if the Mishnah had discussed the midnight deadline and it simply said that, okay, well, those sacrifices that may be eaten for only one day, well, we may have thought that this refers specifically to Kodesh Kalim, which is what this Gemara is talking about. In other words, that there's a concern that somebody might make a mistake and they could eat the meat, after a deadline, and that's going to be more significant in regard to Kodesh Kalim. So to protect this, okay, the rabbis might have decreed only regarding Kodesh Kalim that they should be eaten no later than midnight to try to encourage consumption as early as possible and eliminate, any, concerns that people will eat it after that and eat it at a time where it would be a biblical transgression. So that's why the Gemara is going to bring up in this case the Kodashim Kalim, because that has a 1 day limit on the consumption. The Pesach offering also does as well. So those are similar in that way. So the Gemara now is going to talk about the last part of the Mishnah, and we know that because it's going to bring up and quote. It says, "If so, why did the sages say?" In other words, it brings up the last part of the Mishnah and says, with regards to the mitzvahs that may be performed only until midnight in order to distance a person from sin. So the Gemara is going to say, if you would say that one may actually eat the aforementioned offerings until the light of the dawn arises, as the Torah law permits, the Gemara says one who has such an offering might think that the light of the dawn has not yet risen, when in fact it has risen. And as a result, he will eat the offering in violation of biblical law and incur liability. So that's really serious, because once the time for the consumption of the sacrificial meats expires and the meat of an offering becomes nasser, somebody who intentionally eats it gets karet. So it's really a really serious sin. But if somebody makes this violation accidentally, okay, he still has to bring a chatas offering. So if you have somebody who fails to realize that the dawn came up and he continues to eat the offering, he has a chatas. So it can be very serious, and basically he would be sinning unintentionally, because he would think that the light of the dawn hasn't yet come up, but in fact it has, and he's sinned unintentionally. And the Gemara finishes up and says, since you tell him that he may eat only until midnight, even if he makes a mistake and eats it after midnight, he will not incur that liability, for he will have violated only a rabbinic decree. So I want to point out what the Haredim is saying about this. He's saying that it's noteworthy that the Gemara does not give any reason why the Shema may be recited no later than midnight. And the Haredim says that this is because the Yerushalmi maintains that there is no rabbinic deadline of midnight. As previously explained, according to the Yerushalmi, the sages of the Mishnah view midnight as the biblical limit, for they consider this the end of the period when people lay down to sleep. And Rabban Gamliel does not recognize a midnight limit at all. Hence, the Gemara explains only the reason for the rabbinical decree pertaining to the consumption of the offerings. So that is the note by the Haredim on this. So the rabbis did not, regarding the offerings that can be eaten, biblically until, sunset of the second day, they, it's relatively easy to figure out, the time of sunset. So you're not really worried about that kind of error, but you do have to be worried about this kind of error with the light of the dawn on when that starts to happen. And it's still dark out, there's not much happening, there's a little bit of light, and that's an easy mistake to make. It's not going to be the same as the other types of offerings that expire as the sun is setting, because seeing the sun set, that's easy to figure out. I mean, you can figure that out. You just look and you see it. But the other one is a much harder one, and it could be that the rabbis found it necessary to decree as a fence, which they have the power to do, that the offerings whose time of consumption is until dawn should be eaten before midnight. By the way, you can see a similar opinion about, or explanation about that, in the Tosafot in Zevachim 57b. And that's how I know about the difference between the sun rising and the sun setting, because it's easier to confuse the sunrise than the sunset. That's much easier to figure out. Thank you.